Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to another episode of Business and Innovation Q&A for young entrepreneurs and anyone else. So let's see, we had a number of questions left over from last time. Let me see here. So a question here from Slayer, about, can you give insights about how we scaled up Wolfram research, what important issues, questions we had to tackle, significant lessons learned? Sure, I can try and say a few things about that. First thing to say is that I founded Wolfram Research in 1986. So it's a long time ago. And one question when you start a company is, what do you think the story is going to be? And at that time, I thought this was probably a 5-year story. I was kind of planning sort of 5 years in advance of this is what I thought we could do. This is what I thought would happen with our products and so on. I wasn't planning 35 years in advance. And there are definitely some things that I would have done somewhat differently had I known that I was really setting up a hopefully much more than 35-year story. I had the advantage that this was the second company I had started, second substantial company I had started. And so I had made many of the mistakes that I might have made on this company, on my first company. The most important mistake was not CEOing my first company myself, because I really didn't, at the time, I was sort of a young professor type, and I kind of didn't have the self-image of doing company CEOing. I didn't think I knew anything about it. Turns out that what I counted as common sense turned out to be at least decent business sense, and that was sort of a critical thing in starting my current company, was realizing, yes, I could actually CEO it myself. Now, in terms of scaling it up, the thing to realize is sort of on day one, the company is tiny, and everything can be done in a scrappy way, because it doesn't, it's not like you have 100,000 customers, millions of customers, depending on this or that thing. You have a small number of customers, perhaps, and you kind of almost, well, we never knew their names, actually, because it's a very anonymous business, kind of selling consumer software. But roughly, it's sort of a small community of people you're dealing with, and your employee pool is small. All of those elaborate, very standardized HR practices and so on, you don't need those things when the company is 5, 10, whatever people. I mean, there are different stages companies go through. I mean, one thing, when it's really small and it's sort of single digits to just double digits of people, sort of every single person is a single point of failure. And it's sort of a different, and everybody kind of, that's sort of an important dynamic. And the CEO certainly knows everybody. At some point in the few hundred people, you get to the point where the CEO doesn't know everybody and doesn't routinely interact with everybody. And if you set things up right, you hopefully don't have lots of single points of failure by the time you've scaled up to a few hundred people. I mean, from the point of view of CEOing, companies, I think, are sort of invariant in scale when they get above a few hundred people, because the CEO only deals with a particular sort of layer of people. Perhaps, I mean, I personally always like trying to know as much as possible about everybody who works at our company, but it isn't possible when you have 800 people or something. You just it's not a realistic thing, and you put in place kind of layers of management to make things work. From the CEO perspective, it's kind of almost scale invariant, because there's just 50 people, 100 people, I don't know, of that order who you routinely work with, and then there are lots of people working under those people who you don't directly interact with until you notice, oh, there's this incredibly talented person who should be promoted in some way. That's a different dynamic. I think that for our company, an important issue is, how big should it be? I mean, right now it's about 800 people. It's some things really push for it to be much bigger, and push for us to sort of put more commercial effort, make money that can support more people. But it's something of a strategic decision. How big a company do you want to have? And the advantage of a small company is that it's agile. The disadvantage of a small company is that it doesn't have kind of the inertia and the kind of structure to get lots of things done. And I think that when you have a very large company, well, there are a lot of dynamics that change in terms of, when you get to be one of the world's largest companies, then you're dealing with all kinds of government and this and that and the other things all the time. When you're a very tiny company, none of those things are going to come up in most kinds of businesses that you might be in. And it's, as you go through different scales of company, different kinds of things are important. I mean, there's a scales at which sort of the systematic organization of, I don't know, customer databases, of HR systems, of financial processes and controls and so on become important. Those things aren't important at small scales. And I think one thing we kind of realize, I mean, I knew this perfectly well, at small scales, you can get away with doing things in very scrappy ways. And then you realize, well, when it gets bigger, then fine, we'll have to redo it, and we'll get it right, and we'll build a much more systematic mechanism, and that's okay. And it would have been a mistake to say at the very beginning, let's put in place, a 1,000-page employee handbook that we've carefully written every page when we have 10 people. It just doesn't make any sense, because the issues that come up are things where people can just talk to each other and figure out what to do. If you have many thousands of employees, that's not the story. You've got to have things written down. It's got to be systematic. There's got to be ways where people can know what to expect and so on. So I would say those are some of the kinds of things. Now, for me, in terms of, it's also in terms of people. There's people who do really well in a small company with 10 employees, and there's people who do really well in a big company with 10,000 employees, and they're not necessarily the same people. Partly because kind of the things are, by the time you have thousands of employees, you're dealing with a lot of systems and machinery that's kind of grinding in a certain way. And somebody who comes in and says, "Oh no, I don't want any of that machinery. I'm just going to do it my own special way." That's usually kind of disruptive in a system where there's lots of cogs and wheels that are all running in a systematic way. But in a tiny company, that could be exactly the right thing to do, because there aren't any of those cogs and wheels and so on. And I think one of the things that is an interesting issue in scaling companies is, the people who are there on day one and who do really well when the company has 10 employees, are they the same people? And how do you transition those people to a situation where you have 50, 100, a few hundred employees, and how do their roles evolve? For example, there could be a person who comes in on day one and they're really good at like writing code or something. And then time goes on, and pretty soon you have tens of employees, hundreds of employees, and that person who's really good at writing code, okay, are they going to go and manage a group of 50 people writing code, or are they going to keep doing what you already knew they were good at, which is writing code? And sometimes the correct decision is have them manage 50 people writing code and kind of leverage their sort of strategic skills to do that. And sometimes that's absolutely not the right answer. And the right answer is they're really good at just sitting and writing code. And if you try and get them to manage other people writing code, they just won't do very well at that. And so an important thing is to make sure that you have tracks where people can, if they want to sort of grow in directions that are relevant for a larger company, like managing groups of people, they do that. If that isn't the right path, make sure that it's not dishonorable to stay just being that incredibly productive person who's just writing code. And I think in the growth of our company, we had a bunch of sort of issues with that. I think handled reasonably well, I would say. And my maybe I'm forgetting some horrible disaster, but I think they were handled fairly well. And part of the reason for that probably is because I myself was sort of interested in people and trying to make sure that people are in the right niche and can achieve the best things. And that's something which in the early days of the company, I had to spend a lot more time on than I do now. I mean, now I almost am disappointed at how little sort of mentoring I have to do in the company, because people have, we have a whole structure and a whole setup where really me giving sort of advice to people about how to set things up isn't really terribly relevant. It's like I talked about those kind of gears and wheels and things, and those are kind of running in our company. So I have to do things like this and kind of offer kind of suggestions to the world, so to speak, and not feed them so much into my own company, which doesn't really need this this kind of sort of mentoring at this point. I think another thing, so I mean, this whole process of what do you do with the first generation people as the company goes into different modes, as the company gets to be bigger and have more structure. I mean, typically tiny companies, not very much structure. Company gets bigger, more and more structure, and that's both a good thing and a bad thing. It's a good thing in the sense that if you actually want to have a successful company, you do have to have structure, because if every decision has to be like, oh, let's make a custom decision about that for every single thing that goes on in the company, that's not a scalable proposition. It has to be the case that the right things bubble up to the CEO to get decisions made about them, but most things that isn't happening with them. And for that, you need kind of structure, and you need to be able to set expectations and so on. But the question of what you do with people who have different kind of skill sets or different kinds of things that they like to do, that's an interesting challenge. And sometimes you end up with multiple populations of people where sort of they're people who are in the company for the first few years, and then it's sort of replaced by more people and different people. And it hasn't actually happened so much with our company. A lot of people have been with our company, well, some people 30 years and so on. I think we've been quite successful at finding ways to let people grow with the company. And there are people who are in the company today, been with us for 25 years or more, and are pretty much in the same job that they originally joined us for 25 years ago. And that's the job they really want to do. And that's the job they're really good at doing. And there are other people who might have joined us 25 years ago who joined us in a very sort of small job and now have a very big job, because that was sort of the path that their careers have taken. But I think it's important to be able to support both of those things. You know, another thing I've noticed is back when our company was much younger, there's the question of what does the org chart look like? And there was a time when one of the people involved in the company very early on always used to say, we got to keep the org chart secret. People will be too upset if they're features of this org chart, if somebody's really reporting to somebody and they didn't, and it's like, okay, when you're a small enough company, you can get away with things like that. You can't do that when the company is larger. On the other hand, there is often a certain messiness to org charts, because it's like, historically, this person sort of grew up with this group and they are now running that group, and the group had a period of time when it was very big, and then it wasn't so big because we didn't need those functions anymore, or they got moved somewhere else or whatever else. And the org chart has a certain complexity. And I used to feel really bad about the org chart for our company and how messy it was. And then it was probably a decade or more ago, we were dealing with, let's say, one of the larger tech companies in the world. And we were like very confused, and I kept on asking their executives, what is the structure here? And eventually one of them, who I have to say subsequently got very dramatically promoted at that company, but said to me, what we actually do here is there's this third-party company that does a sort of reverse engineering of what our org chart is. We kind of buy the wall charts that third-party company makes, and that's how we understand what's going on. So I got a copy of this, and indeed, their org chart was kind of messy. And it was like, look, there's obviously a bunch of weird history here and there and the other. And I felt a lot better about our org chart after that. And I actually felt sort of empowered to kind of clean up our org chart, actually. But that had made me feel not as bad about the fact that even a company with just a huge number of employees and a very successful company could end up with that amount of sort of burnt-in history in an org chart. Anyway, so a few comments on scaling up. And I mean, an important thing to say is there are things where it's going to be good enough for 5 years. In the very long term, it may come back and bite you. The trick is to have as few of those things as possible if you expect to have sort of a long-term story. But often companies don't have a really long-term story. Often it is really a 5-year story, and then the company is going to be acquired, or it's going to have some other sort of major event, and things are going to change in it. I think that I mean, another general thing is, don't do things that, do things where you could always justify what you did. That is, it's like you're bringing in people, you're recruiting people, somebody gets paid this, somebody else insists on being paid that. If everybody knew what everybody was paid, which is not the best situation usually, because there's a whole long story associated with it usually. But if people did know, it should be the case that you can feel good about saying, yes, that's the correct thing. It was done this way for reasons that weren't just, oh, I got talked into this by so-and-so. They're really, it makes sense. And it sometimes takes a lot more effort to push back and say, no, I'm not going to do this because I can't really justify it in terms of the big picture of the company. But in my experience, it's always a good thing to do that pushback, although it takes lots of effort in some cases. And there are things there where there are things where I would say there are kind of things that if you're looking at, depending on sort of the time horizon, also it depends a little bit. Many companies, I mean, our company is very unusual in not having outside investors and not having, you know, I don't really have a boss, so to speak, and except my employees and our users and everything else. But I don't have a, you know, it's not a situation where we have kind of a group of investors who are putting lots of pressure through a board on what's going on, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that situation is a very different one, where there are different dynamics about what one should be doing, and you know, and what kind of particularly, I think there are important issues about communication and so on that come up that perhaps don't happen so much in our case. I mean, I would say that, by the way, in the sort of growth of our company, you know, a very common thing is the founder CEO isn't the right person to lead the company, you know, many years later. And I certainly thought about that a lot, particularly when our company was younger. It's like, look, you know, you know, can I get somebody who is going to do better than me at leading this? And there was a period of time in the 1990s when I was working on a big basic science project, and I was kind of like, look, if there's a coup, then let me, you know, pay attention to the coup, because maybe there's somebody who's going to pay more attention and do a better job than I could do. And it's sort of been a disappointment to me that at the time it was sort of a disappointment to me that that didn't really emerge. One thing that happens with a company like ours at the age that our company is, and with all the things we're doing, it becomes very complicated. I mean, you know, our company has just many pieces and many different objectives and so on, and that's made it more difficult to say, oh, I can just retire and let somebody else do this type thing. But I think that I did have in let's see, from starting in 1991, so about 5 years after the company sort of got initially started, I did bring in a chief operating officer person to try and sort of manage the day-to-day operations of the company. And he did well, he was with us for like 6 or 7 years. And he did well at kind of stabilizing a young and perhaps not particularly structurally well-organized company. In the end, his great skill was sort of organizing things. It wasn't doing new things. And in the end, our company is really a company that is very much oriented towards innovation and doing new things. And that didn't quite match in the end, but still, that was a very useful piece of the evolution of our company, was having somebody who was really, you know, trying to just organize stuff, not try and do new stuff, just organize stuff. And in the growth of our company, I suppose another strange thing that happened was that I spent what ended up being a decade really concentrating on doing basic science. And at the very beginning of the company, I'd been sort of driving rapid growth, you know, just let's do more and more and more stuff. And I kind of realized that was too much intensity focused on sort of things we could do as a company at the size we were at that time. And so I kind of throttled back and said, let me go off and do this basic science stuff and let the company sort of mature a bit. I hadn't really planned the timescale of 10 years. I thought it was would be much shorter than that. But then when I sort of came back to really putting intensity into the whole thing, it was a well-organized company that had a much better platform from which to start doing a whole lot of new and innovative things. So, you know, sometimes these things that, you know, this sort of not just keeping on doing the exact same thing with the company all the way through seems to be potentially quite valuable. And for me, it was very, very useful. It's been very useful in several different iterations of this, of kind of being a little bit away from the things for a little while and then coming back into them it gives one kind of a little bit more perspective on what's going on, and I think allows one to be more productive than we've just gone through and just sort of done it all the way through. I mean, I think that the question often is, a founder CEO might be passionate about the particular things the company makes, but they might be pretty terrible at organizing a company above some size. And that can happen. I think there's a tendency for investors to be a little bit more trigger happy than perhaps they should be, of saying, no, the CEO is just crazy, let's replace them and get in a professional, so to speak, who knows how to grow the company. Sometimes that's, it depends what company you are trying to have. If the company is one that has objectives that are not quite the same as the pure investor, make a return on investment type objectives, then that, and often the sort of the soul of the company can be quite lost when you end up with, okay, we brought in the professional CEO. The professional CEO knows how to just sort of grind a company like this to make it make money. But by the way, they're not going to do any R&D or something like this. And the company is has some momentum, but in 5 years, it's kind of going to have used up that momentum, and then it's toast, so to speak. But for those 5 years, it's going to make a whole bunch of money. And by that time, the private equity firm will have flipped the company to somebody else or whatever else. It's a different set of objectives than if you're the kind of passionate CEO who's trying to actually make certain kinds of things happen in the world through the company. But if you're an investor, then it's absolutely the right thing in a sense. If the objective is pure financial investment and return on investment, then having that crazy CEO who's going to do crazy things, like I often do, at the helm, it can be a terrible lose. Let's see. Gosh, so many questions here. A lot of very interesting questions. So, a question from Pakinji here. Are there cultural biases that you had to overcome to break sort of prior limits in the possibilities of your activities? That's an interesting question. I grew up in England, and I would say that the attitude towards entrepreneurial business, at least when I grew up in England, was somewhat different from the attitude towards it in the US. I mean, I didn't think when I was a kid, I didn't think I was going to be running companies. I thought I was going to be a scientist. Even the science wasn't entrepreneurial enough for me in the UK, and that's why I moved to the US when I was about 18 years old or so. Because sort of the science was being done in a more entrepreneurial way in the US. As it turned out, I realized that academia and universities weren't really quite entrepreneurial enough for me, even in the US, and that companies were a better thing. But the concept that you could sort of just start a tech company, well, certainly back in the early 1980s, when I first did this, that concept I don't think really existed in the same way in the UK. And I think in some environments, in different countries, there's a different sort of feeling of, yes, you should go and try and do this ambitious risk-taking thing versus no, you should do the comfortable kind of thing. In England, in polite society, nobody ever talks about money, for example. And at least these things may be totally out of date. I haven't lived in the UK in 40 years. So I say these things as if they were true today. And I'm somewhat amused. My children are often amused when I go to the UK and I'm like, go into a shop, a store, and I'll ask for some product. And the person will look at me like, what are you talking about? And it's like, but don't you have this? And it's like, it turns out, well, actually, no, that went extinct 30 years ago. And now it's, there used to be some indigenous British version of something. And now, no, it's just the international or American version of it that's in England. And there's no translation to British English or anything like that. But so I don't know if that's really fully accurate at this point. But still, I think these, for me, well, there's the sort of the culture of the sort of national culture. And then there's also the culture of sort of the environment was in. I was, in academia, and in academia, nobody at the time really talked about or thought about business. And people often say, oh, I'm going to, in academia, it's like, at least at the time, it was like, oh, yes, maybe I'll get an industrial job. It's a bit sort of step down from, I'll be a fine professor or I'll just get an industrial job. It's kind of having the sense of being in that that grimy factory or something, as opposed to being in the ivory tower, so to speak, of academia. I don't think that point of view has so much survived. I think particularly with kind of the tech companies a cool period, which may be slightly cooling off now, but it's been interesting to live through that one at least. It's that's less a thing at this point, and it's not. It's kind of like there was a certain view at the time of, you can't leave academia. Academia is the most amazing place you can imagine, and there was also a sense that here's another thing I might mention, which may not be so obvious, is there was a sense that business is an ugly struggle for survival all the time, and academia is this kind of peaceful, upscale, pleasant, green field kind of thing. This has not been my experience. The fact is, I'm sure there are parts of business and businesses which are a constant struggle for survival. In the tech business and the sides of it I've been involved in, you do hard work and you do good things and it will go okay. In academia, and things, it will both go okay and people sort of, everybody's doing their own thing. And yes, people are sort of maybe competing with each other and so on. And occasionally there'll be some whole bizarre sort of collision that happens. But generally, people are just doing their thing and trying to get on and make great stuff. In academia, things can be vastly more political, vastly more kind of personal, people attacking each other very personally and so on. I think one of the reasons for that, which I didn't realize until sort of after the fact, is this. In academia, it's kind of, the professors are exposed. It's like the professors are actually doing stuff themselves. And it's like the professor is actually on the committee doing this or that or the other. If you're a CEO in a company, there's a big cocoon of sort of structure of the company. And it isn't the case that you as the CEO are typically the person who's going and having that business discussion with so-and-so and so-and-so. That's something that's being done somewhere else in the company because you have a group that does that. In academia, it's sort of a personal service kind of thing where the professor themselves is doing a lot of this stuff. And I think that's one of the reasons that things get, in a sense, more personal, more ad hominem in academia than they do in the commercial setting. And that's something that people, I have to say, it was one of the things that I didn't like about academia. And it's one of the things that it's good to have sort of this different, less personal setup that you see in the commercial world. But so I suppose that's another sort of cultural adjustment. I mean, I suppose for me, I was never a great cultural fit, I suspect, for the academic world, because I was always like, what can we do next? How can we do something more? What's the strategic thing to do? Which is often not what people are thinking about in academia. It's much more of a process of, we're going to write X number of papers, we're going to get this next grant, we're going to have these committees, they're going to try and, steadily grind and maybe do things. And it's like, no, forget those committees. Let's just decide what to do and then do it. And that's a thing that wasn't really a thing I was finding in academia. And honestly, I was, I think I was sort of a bit of a fish out of water in that environment, although I didn't know that at the time. I mean, at the time I was like, I'm a science kid and I'm, doing science kinds of things, and academia is the place you do that. And the realization that came only later, after I'd sort of seen the other ways to do things in a sort of more entrepreneurial setting, was like, yeah, I really didn't fit in there. And that's why all kinds of weird things happened, is because that wasn't the right environment for me. Let's see. Questions. Gosh. There's lots of questions here, lots of interesting questions. How did I find, from Udesio, how did I find my first employees? Did I have to go to a lot of places to find them? You know, they came from all sorts of random sources. I mean, um, just sort of, you're out and about in the world, you run into people, and it's like uh, uh, you realize this is an interesting person. Hey, I'm got this company. Would you like to come work for this company? I remember I could probably tell the story with names attached because it's kind of fun, but doesn't really matter. But when our products were first out, I was giving a talk. I think it was at Stanford, and there was this young guy in the audience who was like heckling like crazy. And but what he said was very interesting. And I was like, "Who are you? You know, this is really interesting stuff." And I ended up talking to him later. Anyway, he's worked for our company now for, what is it, 20, must be 24, 25 years now, as a very senior person in our R&D organization. And that was, you know, that was somebody where I liked that heckling. I want to hire that person. And you know, that's one of the you know, that's a slightly unusual but not that unusual way to find people. You have to kind of keep your eyes open, and you know, when you run into people who are sort of who you think might be a match for what you're trying to do, well, then try and recruit them. I think also, you know, our company is in a little bit of a different situation now because we've been around a long time, and you know, it's kind of shocking that many of our employees are younger than our product, so to speak. So you know, that's that's sort of a different situation. I would say that on the technical side, that you know, we have it's rather we get a terrific flow of people. On the more business and entrepreneurial side, we're kind of less known for that, and so I would say we don't get as strong a flow of people, and that can be it can be more challenging, and also it's not obvious sometimes when we're trying to hire. You know, one of the general things about hiring people, if you've hired several people into a similar position before, then unless you're kind of a dope, you're probably going to be able to do it okay. The first time you hire a person to do X, where X is some function, you'll often get it wrong. At least that's been my experience. You know, the thing that you think is the key attributes in your organization for that function don't turn out to be the key attributes. Or that type of person, when you interview them, when you talk to them, there will be kind of exposing certain kinds of features, and you don't realize, I don't know, let's say you're hiring, I don't know what type of position, maybe some, maybe it's a technical position, although that's and the person is like telling you, I'll give you an example. You know, the person's telling you a lot of stuff about theoretical computer science, and they know all this stuff about theoretical computer science, and so on and so on and so on. They have all these theories about, and they know all this stuff about agile software developments, and there's amazing theoretical stuff that they know, and they can put all kinds of words to it and so on. And but then it turns out, when you actually realize, oh, I'm hiring a software engineer, I need a person who's actually going to really do stuff. They can have all kinds of theories, but actually doing stuff is important. It has to be said that sometimes having the theories is interesting too, but you kind of get to know, after you've hired a lot of people to do software development, you get to know what you should be looking for, and whether it's, you know, what amount of it is know all the theories and have all the right buzzwords, and how much of it is, oh yeah, I've done these projects before, and you know, I think I can do it, and how much of it is the person thinks they know what to do and you think they don't know what to do, and they're going to come in and they're going to just mess everything up because they're going to say, I know exactly what to do, and it turns out they don't, and they just get everything wrong. But in any case, the point is that, you know, in hiring, whether it's in business development or in legal or in lots of things, or in graphic design, or all sorts of different areas, the first time you do it, it's much more challenging because you don't really know what you're looking for. And sometimes you'll be, at least in my experience, you'll be lucky. Sometimes you won't. Sometimes you'll end up, you know, hiring somebody who's overexperienced, so to speak, when you do it at the first time. Sometimes somebody who's underexperienced. But after you've sort of done it a few times, it gets easier to understand that. I think one of the things in terms of finding one's first employees, the question is, are they one's partners or are they one's employees? It's a much more straightforward situation if they're your employees, because then it's like, well, you're going to decide what to do. If they don't agree with you, maybe they'll quit or whatever, but at least there's somebody in charge. If they're your partners, it's like, well, we all have to agree on what we're going to do, and maybe you won't agree. And that can be a big problem. And so I think it's a lot simpler in a sense if you're in a position to just sort of say, okay, great, join this company. We're going to have all these great things we're going to do. And here's how it's going to be set up. And it's a straightforward story, so to speak. When it's like, well, we're going to get into this together and we're going to make decisions jointly and all this kind of thing, hard to know what's going to happen. Sometimes, I mean, typically when companies are successful enough, the group of friends, so to speak, who are the co-founders, stay friends. When the companies end up sort of going off and, when there's sort of big issues, then somebody will say, well, I'm just not up for taking this high risk thing that we're thinking about doing, or I'm not up for doing 100-hour weeks right now, or I just don't think what you're suggesting the company should do is interesting. I don't want to do it. Well, if you have sort of three partners who are all, trying to pulling the company in different directions, that can be a very complicated situation. And it's often really good in those situations if things can sort of fall apart in a reasonable way. Maybe somebody takes one business unit and goes off and does things with it, and other people take the rest of the company, or maybe somebody just sort of leaves and gets bought out in some sense. I'm not sure, but this idea of having, it's a lot easier if there's a definite person in charge. I mean, then you have to decide the thing that if you're the person in charge, so to speak, it has the downside that then you're the person in charge, and if something goes wrong, it's all your fault. You don't get to blame anybody else. On the other hand, it can be much more efficient because you just sort of, you have a meeting with yourself and you decide what you're going to do and you do it. And it's not something where you have to kind of bounce things around. Now, people often say, you'll get better results if you kind of have people to bounce things off. And that's an interesting theory. It's never really worked for me. It's worked for me well in terms of talented people at the company. But I think that for me, it's like, okay, that's great. But in the end, I'm the CEO who has to decide what to do. And, I can take as much input as I can take. But in the end, I've got to decide what to do. That's worked well for me. I mean, people have often told me, oh, you need a strong board where they'll tell you what to do. And it's like, I don't really want somebody telling me what to do. And often, I know from advising companies and so on, that it's a very, in the end, if people are really going to do things properly, they're going to do them because they themselves decided to do them. If you're kind of puppeting somebody and you say, put this foot in front of this foot, do this, do that, do the other thing, it's really very fragile. It doesn't really work in the end. People they can't sort of think it through for themselves. When the puppeteer disappears, they're like, I don't know what to do now. So, I think it is much better when you can have a situation where the person in charge is the person in charge, so to speak, and where you're not in a sort of consensus setting. Now, I say that for myself. I know that's true for my personality. I'm not certain that's true for everybody else, although I've seen plenty of cases where it's problematic. The case where it's sort of CEOs who don't sort of feel they have the self-confidence just say, I'm just going to decide what to do. I mean, I'll talk to people who are CEO in companies, and they'll be saying, oh, well, I need to bring in this and this and this talented person because I don't understand anything about those areas. And I'll say to myself, that's the place they're going to run into trouble, because, in my sort of theory of things, sort of when you start a company or whatever, day one, CEO kind of has to do everything. And then gradually you sort of can delegate tasks. And at least in my experience, tasks are only really successfully delegated if you kind of understand what has to be done. If it's like, well, I'll just get an expert on that and they'll go do their expert thing, but I don't know what's happening inside there, that's usually a formula for trouble. It's, you might be lucky on a time scale of a year or two, maybe it'll work out. But on a longer time scale, it's like something's going to be like you're going to have, oh my gosh, I didn't realize this or that thing that's been going on for 5 years in that part of the company. I didn't realize this particular thing. It's happened to me plenty of times. And, and sometimes it's like you really actually kind of have to understand all these different functions. It doesn't mean that you're the best person at doing those functions. There can be all sorts of reasons why you're not the best salesperson, you're not the best software quality assurance person, you're not the best whatever, but you have to kind of understand what those functions are. And I think that's also useful in terms of leading people doing those functions, because, in the end, when something comes up and you really have to drill down and see what's going on there, I think people really appreciate the concept that the CEO kind of understands the point of what they're doing. It's not just like, oh, you're this person off there and you do this thing and I don't know and I don't care about what you're doing. It's like, yes, I care. I know what you're doing. I wouldn't do it as well as you do it, or maybe I would do it better than you do it. But it's still, I know about what you're doing and I care about what you're doing. And I think that's a useful thing to communicate. It's let's see, there's a comment from BK here. Partners versus employees, an interesting distinction to discuss, is saying employees complete tasks, partners identify tasks worth investing in. That's a sort of a question. I suppose that could be the case. I mean, I would say that great employees will suggest plenty of things. I mean, one of the sort of assessments I make of us and our company is what fraction of the big ideas we execute came from me. And from my point of view, the smaller that fraction is, the happier I am. Fraction is usually quite large for our company of ideas that are coming from me relative to from other places. But the thing that I aspire to is to have a company where many of the good and big ideas don't come from me. Now, the challenge for me is when you see a good idea, latch onto it and let it grow and don't squash it. And that's something which I think it helps, if you're CEOing something, to have, I don't know, the confidence, so to speak, that it's okay, so-and-so suggested this idea. You don't have to prove that you had all the ideas. It's great if somebody else suggested the idea and it grows from there. And I don't think that I think that the case where people are often suggesting that they're actually, in the trenches doing the work, they realize this is a thing we should be doing. And one of the challenges in management is to make sure that you're open to hearing those things. I mean, it freaks me out every time something happened recently where something which came to my attention, it's like, which we've been doing for years, which is like really dumb, and we should be doing it differently. And it's like, why did nobody tell me this? And then it turned out the people in the relevant group were, yeah, we knew this, but we didn't really we didn't sort of put enough noise into it to really get the thing communicated to the senior management and so on. And it's like, that's a management mistake on our part. That's wrong. There should be a mechanism to get those things that should be heard. Now, if you say, okay, everybody in the company make a suggestion, you'll get all kinds of noise. But the trick is to have it be the case that people feel that when they have a real suggestion to make, that they can contact the CEO, they can go through channels if there are channels, and they can get their point made. I mean, within our company, we just have a suggestions email list and people send stuff there, not at a huge rate, but, I would say that I agree with probably 80% of the things that get sent there. Sometimes I'll agree initially and I'll say, that's a really good idea. And other people will tell me, here are 5 reasons why it's not a good idea. And maybe it wasn't, in fact, a good idea. But that's a very lightweight way to sort of propagate suggestions from anywhere in the company. And it works okay for us. I think the bad case where there sort of are partners, if you have, I don't know, you have I've been on various boards of various entrepreneurial and other companies. I've been through many years where I didn't do that, and then I started doing it for a while, and I'm not sure if I'm doing it or not doing it right now. I do advising of companies. I'm not sure if the board thing is quite my thing. I'm not so much of a committee type person, but the way that the thing that I see there that is frankly, I think, kind of bad is, I'll come in and there'll be a board meeting once a quarter. And somebody there will say, could be me even, hey, I have an idea. I have something you should be doing. Look, do this, and this. Okay, well, maybe some people who are on the board have lots of experience, and they really can come and drop in for that couple of hours and have this brilliant suggestion and figure out what to do. Sometimes that does happen, but I also think that some large fraction of the time, it's like the person drops in, they see a little piece of the story, they say, "Oh, you should do this," and it's not a very useful piece of input. It's really noise in many ways. I think one aspires to not have it be noise, and I think I have done very much better than average on that. But it's still, I think that's not a great situation. And I think when it comes to sort of having this sort of the melting pot of kind of ideas from a group of equals with partners, I'm maybe it's just my personality, but I've not found that kind of dynamic to be one that leads to productive results. It's kind of like, when was a great thing designed by a committee? When was a great company led by a committee? It's probably happened, but it's something that seems, if that's going to happen, there's somebody whose great leadership skill is making that committee happen. That's my point of view, at least. Maybe their skill isn't actually the leadership themselves, but it's leading sort of the mechanics of making something that is more of that committee kind of thing work. Let's see. There's a question here, also from BK. How do you deal with individuals who are strongly convinced that they're knowledgeable on something, but actually have no idea what they're talking about? My approach is direct, but civilized, at least at a personal level. That is, I've tried to build a company culture where people, including me, say what they think. And they say things like I was in some meeting today where I was telling some group that the thing they'd done was magnificent, but then they were telling me that it was going to be delayed by 6 months. And I was giving them a super hard time about that and being very direct in sort of not happy about their logic for that and how could it possibly be the case, and so on and so on and so on. So I think that, to me, if you set a culture of directness, it makes things a lot easier. If people kind of expect you're going to tell them, if you think it's really a lousy piece of work, you're going to tell them it's a lousy piece of work. They're not going to be wondering, did I get away with that lousy piece of work? Or does this person think this is a lousy piece of work, but they're not saying it? If it's a lousy piece of work, you tell them it's a lousy piece of work. If it's a good piece of work, you try and communicate that it's a good piece of work. I think, there are cases where people will be kind of, I think the main way to deal with the situation where people are kind of spouting off of, there's a whole bunch of jargon of this, that, and the other thing, is you've got to know a fair amount yourself, and you've got to be able to peel those things back. I take a very, you can call it either confident or arrogant point of view, which is I take the point of view that I can understand anything. And so if somebody tells me, oh, this thing has to work this way because blah, 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 some whole bunch of jargon that I don't know, I take the point of view, if I drill this down, I will be able to understand it. If I cannot understand it, it's nonsense. And so then you have to start peeling it back. And sometimes the person will sort of say, oh, are you serious? You don't know what a blah, blah, blah is? That's like, I'll say, yeah, I don't know what a blah, blah, blah is. Tell me what a blah, blah, blah is. And you have to kind of have the confidence to do that, and to believe that at the end of it, you're not going to be in a situation where you say, oh, okay, there are all these complicated things. I don't really understand anything. I can't see whether what you're saying makes any sense. You've got to believe, and it's got to be the case, that you can drill it down to the point where you can tell, does it make sense or not? Where you can connect it to other things where you just get the whole logic of what's being said explained. And people will tend to, there's a tradition, I think it might be particularly bad in Silicon Valley these days, although maybe even in this year that's changed. I haven't been there for a year, so more than that actually, so I wouldn't necessarily know. But there tends to be a bit of a tendency for people to sort of come up with, you'll ask them about something and they'll be like, oh yes, that's very easy. Lots of jargon, lots of things, of course I know how to do that. Of course, it's all easy to figure out. Really? Just let's unpack that a bit. And sometimes you kind of you can feel, it's very easy to be sort of browbeaten into, oh, you don't understand that? Then of course you can't understand what I'm talking about, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Just don't let that happen. My late friend, Richard Feynman, who was a physicist, he always used to have this point of view. He said, there are no experts, he said. You can, everybody, if you're smart about things, you can always understand everything. I'm not completely sure I agree with his, I think experts and knowing a lot of stuff and having a lot of experience is useful. But I think that it is not the case that there are unexplainable things. So for example, this will happen the other way around. People will say to me, oh, like even today, it was something where somebody was saying, I think this is all figured out, right? And I'm saying, look, I'm sure it isn't figured out. This person's saying, but look, I know about this and this and this, I think it's all figured out. Okay, so, I'm saying, let me tell you my logic for why I don't think it's figured out. My logic is basically, this is an area that has sort of stakeholders from many different places. There are too many stakeholders that it can be that easy to figure out. It's going to take longer to figure out something where there are this many different domains which are affected by it and so on. And so, you have to be able to explain yourself to the point where even when what you're going on is some kind of hunch, you have to be able to, I'm very often tend to go back and say, oh, I remember that thing that happened 25 years ago that I'm reminded of here. Let me tell you the story of what happened then. And, people will be saying, oh, but this is actually, people usually respond quite well to seeing how things played out. We made this mistake 20 years ago. We did, 20 years ago, we started being very enthusiastic about virtual reality, but it all went splat. And, now, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And here's what people were saying at the time. And here's why we misunderstood the signals and spent a bunch of effort on something which went splat. We didn't, in fact, put that much effort into that particular thing. But that's the type of thing to think about. And I think in general, it's like, have confidence, that you can understand stuff. I see this in managers in our company when, and really it's something in the culture of our company, it's like people expect to understand stuff. And it's not, oh, somebody's just doing this magic thing and they don't explain to me what they're doing. It's like, it should be understandable. I think that's a worthwhile way to fight that sort of issue. Let's see. Something here I don't know about, actually, from Leo, comment about discussion on probably Lex Fridman's podcast about political games Steve Jobs and his people played, a kind of high-level thing. What does that really mean? Not sure I can answer that. I don't know exactly what you're referring to. I think I knew Steve Jobs, I would say, decently well. I think he was in some ways a very direct person, but he was also a person who would kind of, he would express what he was thinking, and that might change from day to day. And some people found that very confusing, and it felt, I think, very kind of arbitrary. And he always used to use the word mercurial to describe the way that people described him. It was his favorite word when he was first putting dictionaries onto the Next computer. He would always look up the word mercurial and say that was how people described him. But in any case, I think that has sort of the appearance of perhaps more, quotes, politicking than there was. I don't know about that. The question from ICU. In the beginning, how many of your decisions about the company were gut instinct versus market research versus customer feedback versus something else? I would say in that set of choices, gut instinct would be the top one. I mean, there's sort of back of the envelope calculations you can do that say, look, roughly how many customers could there be? Roughly how much is each of them going to pay for something? Roughly how many people am I going to need to support this? And maybe you can get those things right. I'm not sure that I would have gotten them exactly right, but you can get them at least in the right ballpark. I mean, if you're making something where there's only 10 people in the world who care about it, and it can only be sold for $100, you're not going to be able to build a big company out of that. But as soon as you can see there's plenty of growth potential. We don't know quite how much growth potential, but there's sort of plenty, and people. It's valuable enough to people that people can spend at least a decent amount of money on it. Then that's a good start. Now, there are often many other dynamics about how companies work. What are the distribution channels? Okay, you have this great thing, but will anybody actually be able to get to use it at the time when they need to use it? Will anybody even understand what you have? Will it be? I'm afraid I often think that some of the things we build are like artifacts from 100 years in the future, and that's both sort of perhaps a intellectually satisfying thing. It's a commercially frustrating thing, because it's like, yes, some people get it and they do amazing things with what we build, but some other people are like, oh, I don't get it. I'm back 100 years in the past. So I think that that there's to me, when I remember my first company, I had brought in somebody to CEO it, and we'd brought in, actually, I was quite involved in this, raising investment money and so on. And then there was, this market study that got done, and it was just all nonsense. I mean, it was kind of like, come on, I suppose one of the things that happens, I'm a kind of quantitative and data oriented guy. And, when you are looking at one of these, we're going to do an expert market study of this thing, and you're realizing, look, I understand quantitative stuff. You're not going to wow me with a bunch of charts and a bunch of tables of numbers. I can read the tables of numbers. Thank you very much. And I know that number just has no basis. You just made it up. It doesn't come from anywhere. Now, when you're in a business, if you're in a business that's been around a long time, and where all the machinery is already running, and you're selling breakfast cereals or something, and there's a huge amount of knowledge of exactly how that works, then yes, you can absolutely do market studies, you can do focus groups, you can do all of these things, but that's in a well-established business. That works well in a well-established business. If you're doing something for the first time, nobody's got any idea. You say to people, for example, when I was describing Wolfram Alpha to people before it existed, if I'd listened to what people had said, there's absolutely no way that product would have been built, because essentially everybody I described it to was like, huh? What does that mean? Oh, you mean it's like the Star Trek computer? Huh? Can we really build that right now? It was a complete lack of understanding of what it was. And until one actually had it to show to people, people didn't get it. Once you could show it to people, people understood at least parts of it very, very easily. But until you had it to show, when you were just sort of waving your hands and describing, I'm going to build this, it's like, well, is that like a this or like a that? There's another thing, by the time you're trying to build something new, and every person you describe it to says, is it like this or is it like that? And those things are far away from what you're trying to build. Well, then you're not going to get a lot of helpful input by sort of comparing what else is out there, because you're doing something for which maybe there isn't a name for that product category. There wasn't a name for the product category that is Wolfram Alpha. We called it a computational knowledge engine, but that wasn't an existing thing. It's not a search engine. It's not a database. It's not a whatever. It's a different kind of thing. And particularly in cases like that, it's super difficult to get really useful feedback from kind of the well-developed mechanisms of sort of testing the market and so on. I think that customer feedback, that's another complicated one. People, I would say it's much more important to look at what people do than to listen to what they say, because it's like, and I notice this even with myself, I use all kinds of software and devices and all this kind of thing. And sometimes, I'll run into the CEOs of the companies that make them, and they'll say, hey, do you have any suggestions about whatever it is? And I'm like, well, I don't know. I just use it. And sometimes I'll say, and this particular, because I'm a person who pays attention to things like software design, I'll say, well, this particular feature really is, I find annoying, and you could fix it in this way. But it takes me a lot of effort to come up with that. And most of the time it's just like, well, I just use it. If the person says, well, can you make me a suggestion? I'll come up with something totally random, really. And I see that over and over again. And people where you say, you have this thing, you use it. Now, if you watch the person use it and you realize they're doing this thing and then they're clicking here and they're doing that and they're doing this very elaborate thing, and you're like, oh dear, I should have thought of that. We should provide some direct way to do that. Yes, you can get a lot of information from that. I mean, I'll give you an example of watching what people do. So years ago, when we used to have physical product boxes, they had all kinds of documentation in them, and they were big box, and it was full of floppy disks and later on CDs and whatever else. And it had, all these different pieces and, booklets and this and that and the other. Okay, so, we'd ask people, well, is it important to have documentation for this or that thing? People say, oh, yes, very important to have that documentation. And it's et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so one day at our, I think at one of our annual technology conferences, we did this kind of focus group thing with some of our experienced users, and we had them just open a product box. And it's like, let's watch these people do it. Let's see what they look at. And these people are opening this thing and they're looking at these different components and so on. They're saying, oh my gosh, I had no idea there was a thing like this. Oh, let me look through this. Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that was there. And, so there was sort of a lot of failure in the way that we had communicated the things we had. And even some of the things that we had, which people had said, oh, this is, actually, no, the biggest learning from that was people would open the box and there were these things we put a lot of effort into, and people said, we really need this, we really need this. People would look at it and say, I don't know, I don't think I'm going to read that. It's something documenting, what all the menus and the user interface are. You know what, if I want to see the menus, I'll just look at the menus. I'm not going to read a book about what menus there are, and they just sort of toss it aside. So I think that was a kind of, oh drat, we spent a whole bunch of effort developing all that documentation, and nobody's ever read it, and nobody's ever going to read it. And these experienced users of ours didn't even know it was in the product box. So that was a mistake. But you could learn that by watching what people do, more so than by saying, let's do a survey. Is it important to you to have documentation for what all the menus do? Oh yes, it's important, because that's what somebody thinks. Somebody says, do you think it should be documented? Oh, sure, it should be documented. But when it really comes to it, it's not something you're going to use. All right, I should be wrapping up soon here, but let's see, maybe another question or two. There's questions here about a couple of questions about open source. Is it possible to earn money doing free software? Is it possible? What is open source good for from your perspective? I think the thing to realize is making software takes work, and somehow people have to, they have to live, they have to eat, they have to, be able to spend their time creating something. And there are a whole variety of different business models for how that should work. My goal in what we've done is to try and align the things that we want to put effort into as closely as possible with the things that are providing value for the actual customers of the thing we're making. So in other words, we make a great piece of software. People who use the great piece of software pay us for using the great piece of software because it adds value for them, rather than something where it says, well, the people who are using the software, they don't pay us, but the people who are advertisers, who are getting the data about the people who are using the software, they're our real customers, and it all gets very complicated. For me, it's much simpler life if you're basically just saying, the people who are getting value from what you're doing are the people who are paying you to do what you do. Now, we have plenty of things that we provide for free, whether it's Wolfram Alpha, whether it's free Wolfram Engine for developers, those kinds of things. It's a complicated sort of shell game of what, where is the place where people are going to pay for value and where you can, where that aligns with the things you're actually putting work into. I think people sometimes think, it's this magic thing. Somebody out there is going to develop this. It's going to be, open source and developed by the crowd, the world. Well, somebody's actually going to have to do it. And when it comes to software, it's not something where you're just adding one little, sentence to something. It takes real work. It takes real engagement to build a good piece of software. And what I think has tended to happen is that people have, a couple of things to say. First thing is, when you are going to build something that's never been built before, that takes leadership. It takes somebody figuring out what to do. It's not something where people just say, oh, we're going to get this whole group that's going to come together from different places, and they're going to, they're going to magically assemble this thing. It takes there being some blueprint for what to do. And it takes somebody leading that. And so you have to have sort of a mechanism that allows that leadership to happen. And I know many people who've been responsible for many well-known open source software efforts, for example, and where the people sort of launched them, and then actually even their communities largely rejected them. And it became actually a very painful and bitter thing for those people as individuals that, look, I had this good idea, I launched this thing, and now nobody listens to me, and they're off doing the wrong thing, so to speak. And and they can't sort of continue to inject leadership into the whole effort. One of the things that we've been successful at doing, which I think is very unusual, is that yes, for 34 years, we have been pointed in one direction, consistently doing something under definite leadership, so to speak, and we've been able to make that happen, and that's an unusual thing, and that's something that I think is made possible by this sort of alignment between sort of how we're supporting the effort and where the value is going. I think also what tends to happen is that there's too many in the modern world, too many kinds of sleights of hand where it's like, yes, it's open source, it's free. Well, actually, if you want to really use it with the security patches that make it work, well, then you pay a bunch of money for that. And it certainly frustrated me that we've had a number of systems that we've got at our company where they were sort of sold on the basis of being open source. And then it's like, why do we have a bill for a huge amount of money for this? It was supposed to be a piece of open source software. Oh, well, actually, the only version that's usable is this one that has all these extra things. Or, well, actually, it was open source, but it's not open source anymore. It was just open source as a way to kind of open the market, so to speak. And then it closed down and started sort of doing the traditional enterprise software thing. Or, other kinds of models where you say, well, it's free to use it, but you have to license the patents underneath. Or, well, it's free, but you can't actually use it. You're going to need to buy service to get the thing set up and so on. Or, a thing that is a dynamic that one's seeing quite a bit recently is people say, well, I'm going to give it away for free, and that's going to be great, and I'm going to have this model where I make money on service and so on. And then big cloud providers will pick up the software. They don't need the service. They've got thousands of people who can make a fork of that software and go do their own thing with it. And then it's like the people who originally made it were like, well, we had this scheme. Our scheme was we were going to give away the software and going to make money on the service. And oh my gosh, you can't do this. And it's like, well, there's this license agreement that says we can do this. And so, things like that happen. And one of the things that I've been very interested in is, as sort of the world evolves, how do we best take the things we've built and deliver them to the people who should be using them, and create an ecosystem where we can go on doing innovative things, and we can do that in a way that is sort of effective in the world. And it's something where you basically, there is money that's needed in the picture. And whether typically when you peel back the sort of the story of successful open source software projects, you end up finding there's a big company that's motivated to have this thing exist, and they're paying for it, and that's fine. I mean, it's I think and certainly many of the things that are created in sort of the open source world, we make plenty of use of in our technology stack. And we know the people who make them. We're very happy. We often contribute to those open source projects. It's a good thing. But I think in terms of the what you're making, and by the way, the whole question of should people be able to read the source code? Nobody cares about reading the source code. We've often had large chunks of source code open for like my favorite example was a decade of source code that was open, which had comments which we hadn't really looked at, but they happened to be in Russian because the people who've been developing that section were kind of writing to themselves, and they happened to be Russian-speaking folk. And nobody noticed for a decade. And it's like, okay, it's so important to have this. Okay, I think it's just a checkbox. And from our point of view, it's a checkbox. Sure, we can provide that for people. It's not really a big deal. I don't think it's particularly useful. It's useful in things like our function repository, where there are pieces of Wolfram language code where they're expected to be small enough that somebody can actually modify them, and that works great. But when it's like, let's expose 10 million lines of code, sure, we could do that, but I'm not sure it's very useful to anybody. In terms of, is there a way to, how do people make money from open source software? Well, there are many business models. I would say some, to me, are more savory than others. I mean, some are frankly, as far as I'm concerned, kind of a swindle. Others are more sort of on the up and up. I think that, in the model, of, oh, you should just make money from, the sort of sweat of the brow of doing services type work. I don't know. I mean, I think that seems like an abdication of responsibility for the leadership of driving the product forward, and kind of an excuse for, well, the product doesn't work very well. Yeah, we know that, but you can buy the service that lets you actually do things with it. So I think those are a few comments. I mean, I think it's become, what I've noticed is there was a period of time when there was a lot of kind of righteous, everything should be free, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, whatever free means, because, is free, you can use it free, or is it free as in you can modify it, or what is it? And what actually matters to people? And certainly, for me, it's very important that a bunch of things we build, we make available for free to people. But I think that the sort of the righteous edge of kind of it's got to be open source because that's the righteous thing to do. I kind of feel like that righteous edge has been very much blunted in recent years, partly because, quite frankly, a lot of large companies have taken advantage of that whole story to do things that in the end are just sort of stories of, well, we'll take the money out somewhere else. I mean, I could tell you lots of shocking stories about executives from various companies who've certainly confided in me, and that's why I'm not going to tell you about it. Things about, yeah, well, everybody thinks they've got their pitchforks out and they're being very successful, but actually we're making more money from the back door, so to speak. Even though they think with the pitchforks and they're, we're going to make everything open, that they're coming out ahead, they're not. That's one of those stories of sort of the corporate world, I think. All right, I think maybe one more. Let's see, one more thing, and then I should. Okay, there's a question here from D0 something. How do you assess people to figure out their niche? That's a super interesting question. It's a question for people within themselves to figure out a niche, and for people from outside to figure out, given this person, what's the right niche. I think, in terms of management of companies, leadership of companies, I think a big responsibility of management of a company, for example, or management of anything, is to say, I've got these things I want to do, these things I'm thinking about doing. I've got these people who are either here or I could get here. How do I match these two things up? It's this giant sort of puzzle of how do I match people with things that can be done. And sometimes the things you'll do, for us, it's like there's some things where we have to do them, but there's some things where if the right person comes along, let's do it. But if we don't have the right person, we're going to be pushing that rock uphill and it's just not going to work. And we might as well just wait a couple of years, 5 years, whatever, until we have the right person to really make a big thing out of that. In terms of people, I would say that when one is interacting with people, interviewing them and so on, my basic rule of thumb is you've just got to be able to understand a decent amount about the person. And if after you've had that hour interview, if you think to yourself, what would that person do in this situation with this project that we're thinking maybe that person is a fit for? And if you say, I don't have the slightest idea, it's not the right person to hire. For whatever, that person might be a fantastic person. I mean, the thing to realize is, I'm sure in my life, and I probably could even think of examples, I've interviewed people who are fantastically successful people who I rejected. And it was the right thing for me to reject them because they wouldn't have been successful in our environment. And sometimes people have even told me that, thank you for not hiring me, or thank you for whatever, because it wouldn't have been the right thing. Sometimes there are people who I'll have at our company, and I'll tell them, you are not going to be happy with us. Go start your own company. You will be never be happy working for somebody else, or something like that. Or you'll never be happy in a company of our size. You should be working in a big company with much more structure than we have, or a company with a different kind of company culture than we have. But so, it's not the case. There's no sort of absolute, this is a good person, this is a bad person. It's like you've got certain niches, and there are people, and do they fit? And do the people fit in general into the niche that is the culture of your company? And that can be, that can vary, and it can vary over time. I mean, what's relevant for a startup company is different for what's relevant for a company with 800 people or with 10,000 people or whatever else, in terms of what kinds of people are appropriate. But in terms of how you assess whether people are appropriate for some particular niche, it's like, get to know them. And, what I find is, I don't know, there are people who have very structured interviewing techniques where it's like, I'm going to ask these 5 questions. And, and I've kind of, I suppose if you've got enough data on how people answer those 5 questions, maybe that's useful. But for me, it's like, I might ask those 5 questions, but they might all be questions that just don't really get at the story of this particular person. And, for me, in terms of leading company, I suppose my goal is to find situations where people can really do fantastic things that maybe they didn't even realize they were capable of, where you're really able to sort of get what somebody can offer and make the very, very best use of it. And I think that if you say everybody's got to fit in this box, this box, this box, you're not going to be able to do that. And I think you get, a great deal of extra productivity from being able to put people really in the right place, in a place where they're enthusiastic, where their skills are really a good fit. Sometimes they don't know those skills are a good fit. Sometimes, one of the things that I certainly find interesting is when we're hiring for kind of new job categories where people just that skill just never came up. Like I remember years ago when we were first hiring linguistic curators for Wolfram Alpha, where it's like, what was important was people writing little fragments of algorithmic code that represented pieces of natural language. And so in that particular case, that was a case where we could test people. We could say, I think one of our things was write down as many ways that you can think of to say, how do you make change for 35 cents? And people who are good at this, just like 100 things, like lots and lots of different possibilities. And they're like, okay, I didn't know I could do that. I never tried to do an exercise like that before. And there were people who were really good at that. There were people maybe who had PhDs in computational linguistics who were really terrible at that. It wasn't their particular skill. But I always find it interesting whether these kind of new job categories. I mean, there's one that actually it's one we've had before, but we've just sort of re-energized it, which is user experience quality inspection, so to speak. It's like, does this user interface really make sense? Sort of which is different from user experience design. It's different from software quality assurance. It's a sort of a new category of thing. And it's like some people are really good at it. Some people aren't. People who are UX designers may not be good at it. People who are in quite different area may be good at it and not even know they were good at it. It's like, of course, I've noticed that there's this weird thing that happens on my cell phone when I click this. Of course, I've noticed that. Doesn't everybody notice that? So it's always fun when you can identify these things which people are, really interesting skills that people have that they didn't even know they had. But I think in general, the thing that is always important in terms of assessing people, at least in my mind, is just get to know the person, get to know how they think about things. Talk to them typically about things that they know about. I mean, if you spend all your time talking about some particular, I don't know, job function at the company or something, and you don't ever hear about anything they know about, you're not going to learn much. I also find, look, in terms of myself, and perhaps this is more a statement about me than anything else, but when I do an interview and I realize I did most of the talking in that interview, I know myself well enough to know that's not going to work. Because what's happened is, I was sort of asking things and I was kind of helping the person. And it's like, that's not the way it should work. It's kind of like you set it in motion, and then it's kind of like the person has something interesting to say and you're responding to that and so on. And that's usually one of my kind of, I think about it afterwards, and it's like, there's something wrong there. But that's, to my mind, it's just like, get to know the person and be interested enough in the person that you feel like getting to know the person. And by getting to know them, I mean, you don't have to be able to answer whether they're a cat lover or a dog lover. But what's relevant is sort of, how do they think about the kinds of things that they might be relevant to doing at the company? Are they people who are able to be sort of really stick to a particular task for a long period of time? Are they people where you're going to give them a task, they're going to be incredibly organized, they're going to stick to it for 6 months? Or are they going to be people where you tell them, can you do this? And then half an hour later, they're going to have it done. But if you said, do this task for 3 weeks, they'll be like totally confused and they won't organize the thing at all. The different kinds of people, be able to answer what kind of person it is that you're dealing with. And, there's questions like, do you have to like the person? Not really. I don't even think about that particularly. It's I don't know what like means. I mean, in terms of, do you, this is what the question is the person going to fit this niche, and are you going to have a good time working with them? Which is a quite different question for, do you have this or that social reaction to this person? I don't consider that, and sometimes there are people where it's like, this is a lovely person, it just be such fun to chat with this person, but I know they'll do a terrible job. There'll be lots of fun to chat with, but they'll be chatting all the time and they won't actually get anything done, or some other dynamic like that. I mean, it's a sort of a different dimension, I think, from other kinds of things. I think also sometimes, when you try and understand what people have done in the past, and there are things about what they've done that just don't make sense to you, that just, it's like, why did they go from here to there? What happened? It's like, usually it's, in my mind, it's worth understanding that, not because, some job didn't work out. Okay, big deal. But it's like, why? And not, oh, this person was a bad person because this didn't work out or whatever, but just you learn something about kind of the way that person deals with things by just understanding what happened there. All right, I better wrap up here. Well, thanks for joining us. And I've been doing all kinds of live streaming. This is my pandemic activity, so to speak. Well, I've been doing a lot of work on lots of other things. But do subscribe, follow us, all those kinds of good things. And just in terms of scheduling, I might mention on Fridays, I do a science and technology Q&A for kids and others, and try and answer all kinds of questions about how things in science and technology and so on work and such like. Then on alternate weeks in this time slot, I'm doing this Q&A about business and innovation, and I'm doing also a Q&A in alternate weeks about history of science and technology. Also, in my strange live streamed life, we also live stream many internal, particularly software design review meetings. We just did one right before this, actually, that are kind of I think you can't see it anywhere else. Actually, the internal dynamics of how decisions are getting made on the building of our Wolfram language and our technology stack. So anyway, well, thanks for joining us here, and look forward to